Hello everyone. In this video, we are going to look at a brilliant game played by Magnus Carlsen versus Alexander Grischuk, maybe in the year 2007 or 2009. This game focuses on improving your middle game, so I hope you're ready to improve your middle game or even your overall game. So let's begin. Okay, so Magnus Carlsen is playing with white and Alexander Grischuk is playing with black. Magnus opens the game with 1 e4. We have c5 by Grischuk, the Sicilian defense, knight f3, and now we have d6. d4, takes. We have the open Sicilian, knight f6, attacking the pawn on e4, knight c3, and now we have the move a6, also known as the knight off variation. The whole idea behind a6 is to cover the square of b5, and on the next move, now black can go for playing the move e5 or even e6. We have bishop to e2 by Magnus, and now we have the move e6, also known as the Scheveningen Sicilian. So black can also go for playing the move e5, that's absolutely fine, but we have e6 by Grischuk, and now we have castle up. Bishop e7, a4. So the idea behind a4 here is to stop the move b5. Because black wants to play the move b5, putting the bishop on b7, which is a good square for the bishop, which attacks the pawn on e4 with the knight and the bishop. So once black achieves b5, I believe black would be pretty happy. So what white is doing is simply stopping the move b5 with the move a4. We have knight c6 now, and now bishop e3. Magnus and Grischuk, both the players, are simply developing the pieces. We have castle, and now we have the move f4 by Magnus Carlsen. So what's the idea of f4? So basically after f4, white is actually playing on these 4 ranks, whereas black is playing a bit passively, not a bit passively, but a bit solidly by putting his pieces on the 3 ranks. That's it. So the question here is, how is white going to take advantage of this as he's having more space in the center? The question is how white is going to do a breakthrough. So after f4, which is a pretty fine move, we have queen c7 by Grischuk. So queen c7 is a very flexible move, a good square for the queen. As we have already inserted a6, the knight can't really jump to b5, attacking the queen. And now after queen c7, black is having many options. Maybe the rook goes to d8, maybe the rook goes to e8. We have king h1 by Magnus. You see, the king is on g1. So basically, this particular diagonal from g1 to a7 is a bit weakened. So white is just moving the king to h1, which is a bit more safe place for the king. And now we have the move rook e8 by Alexander Grischuk, which is the best move. And now you can ask me, what is the idea of rook e8? Won't rook d8 would be much better, putting the rook on the same file as the queen? Yeah, definitely you are right. But the whole idea behind rook e8 here is, you see, white is having 2 breaks. White can go for playing the move e5, or white can go for playing the move f5. Now e5 is a bit less possible because black is having the queen, knight and the pawn, 3 pieces defending the e5 square, whereas f5 is a bit more natural response. And the moment white achieves f5, black can take on f5 and the rook on e5 is simply opened up. So you see, that's the whole idea. Rook on e8 is much better compared to the rook on d8. Now we have bishop to f3 by Magnus, putting the bishop on a nice diagonal, so that whenever maybe he can get the chance to open up the possession, the bishop on f3 would be on fire, looking at the complete diagonal till a8. Now we have bishop to f8 by Grischuk, trying to open up the rook. Now we have queen d2. You see, all the white's pieces are nicely placed. The bishop on e3 is still undefended, so queen d2 makes a lot of sense. And now the rooks are also well connected. So yeah, white is also pretty fine. We have rook to b8 by Alexander Grischuk. And now the idea of rook b8 here is, now let's say white plays a random move like h3. Now our idea could be to simply take on d4. Once white recaptures it back, maybe black can simply play the move b5. Obviously not in this particular position, but there are some ideas like this. And after takes, the rook defends the pawn, and black can simply expand with b4. Of course, in this position, there is e5 coming up, so I'm not really saying that you should play the move b5 in this particular position, but this is one of the ideas that black is banging on. So, after rook b8, white played the move queen to f2. Putting the queen on a nice square, the idea could be to move the knight and just take control of the dark square diagonal. We have e5 by Grischuk now, trying to open up the center, because you see both sides pieces are nicely well developed. The question is, who is going to open up the position? So Grischuk took his chance by playing the move e5. We have a trade-off pawn, and now we have knight to b3. Now after knight b3, if you try to understand this particular position, it looks like the bishop on f3 is simply a bad piece, because there is pawn on e4 and the pawn on g2, which makes the bishop bad. And also at the same time, the pawn on e4 is an isolated pawn. An isolated pawn is the one where there is no d and the e pawn to defend the pawn. If the pawn would have been on d3, then it's fine. But there are no f or the d pawn, which makes the e4 pawn an isolated pawn. And now we're going to understand how, like, generally isolated pawns are weaknesses in the endgame. So if we just try to go into the endgame, it would be good for black. But now we're going to understand how Magnus continues the position to convert this particular weaknesses to his advantage. So after knight b3, we have the move knight to b4 by Grischuk. You see the pawn is on a4, so the b4 square is a bit weakened up. So black just put the knight on b4, attacking the pawn on c2 as well. You see, you can't just move the queen because the c2 pawn simply collapses. So the queen needs to remain on f2 to defend the pawn on c2. And now we have the move bishop a7. Now bishop a7 is a move which is very hard move to play at the club level, because bishop a7 idea here is to kick the rook to a8. You see, the rook on b8 is much better compared to the rook on a8. So first, white kicked the rook back to a8, and now he played the move bishop b6. You see, white wanted to play the move bishop b6 in this particular position, but he's like, okay, let me first make the rook bad, and now I'm going to play bishop b6, kicking the queen to e7, and now, you see, the bishop on b6 is a good piece, stopping b5, covering d8, covering c7, which makes a lot of sense. And now Magnus is like, okay, now let me try to get all my pieces. Rook ad1 makes sense. And now black plays the move bishop e6, which turns out to be a mistake. Now in this position, the best move in this position for black is to play the move bishop g4, which is in general very hard to find, because like from black's perspective, if I just try to rotate the board, in this particular position, it looks like the bishop is simply bad, covering, like staring at his own e4 pawn, g2 pawn. The bishop is like a tall pawn doing nothing. But the whole idea behind bishop on f3 is a good piece actually, because it turns out white can put the knight on d5. Thanks to the bishop on f3, it covers the square on d5. So that's the whole idea. Black should try to remove the bishop from f3 by playing the move bishop g4, and it would have been the best, but he played the move bishop e6, which is more human. And now Magnus took his chances by playing the move knight d5, attacking the queen, knight. And now you see many pieces are hanging, so black needs to take the knight from d5. The question is how? You can take the knight with the b knight, you can take the knight with the f knight, you can also take the knight with the bishop. Let's try to understand what happens if you take with the b knight. Now it can simply take it back, the bishop is hanging. Now there are two options, the bishop can simply drop back, or black can do a counter attack with e4. If black tries to counterattack with e4, after takes, white is simply a pawn up. So if the bishop goes back, it's even worse for black, because after d6 attacking the queen has to come forward, as that's the only square. And now already after knight c5, the queen is hanging, the pawn is hanging, and you see many things are happening, hanging, and white is simply not better, but just completely winning. So that's why you can't really capture with the b knight. If you try to capture the knight with the f knight, after takes, the bishop goes back, there is simply bishop h5. Why? Because there is no bishop on e6, which makes f7 square very weak. There is rook, queen lining up on the f file, so white can use this opportunity to attack the weak f7 pawn, creating pressure on the f file. Black can try g6, attacking the bishop, but after d6, attacking the queen move, knight c5, you see every piece is coming up, and it turns out everything is collapsing for black, and black is completely losing. So that's why you can't really capture with the f knight as well. So black decides to capture the knight with the bishop. We have takes, and now Grischuk is like, and now you see in this particular position, finally the bad e4 pawn, the isolated pawn, has converted into a fine pawn. Not a fine pawn, but also a passed pawn. At the same hand, black is also having a pass pawn of his own. Now it's all about race. Black pushes the pawn, white also pushes the pawn, attacking the queen. And now we have queen e6. Now a better move would have been to centralize the queen with queen e5. But I personally believe the reason why Grischuk didn't play the move of queen e5 here is he wanted to cover the square of d7. Because after queen e5 it looks like white can simply push the pawn. The rook defends the pawn, the bishop covers the square, and the pawn attacks the rook. You move the rook, I make queen. But actually in this position, Grischuk can simply take the pawn with the knight, and after takes, I believe Grischuk thought and assessed this position as better for white because it is better for white. The f7 pawn is very weak, the rook is nicely placed on d7, attacking the pawn on b7. It looks very uncomfortable, very unpleasant for black, but it was the best option. So instead he decides to play queen e6, which allowed Magnus to play the move knight c5 attacking the queen, queen f5, the bishop move. We have a trade of queens, and now what's happening? Now in this particular position, the knight is attacking the b7 pawn. That's one threat. Another threat here is to just push the pawn to d7. As the bishop covers the d8 square, the pawn attacks the rook. It already looks like white is very pleasant. So black came up with the idea with knight b to d5, attacking the bishop, also removing this control, removing the coordination from the rook with the pawn, attacking the bishop. Now Magnus played the move a5, and now we have the move knight cross b6. Now many of you can wonder what happens if bishop takes the pawn. What's happening? Now in this position, white is having a very nice move. You can try to pause the video and try to find the move. Okay, now white is having a very nice move in this position, which is sacrificing the rook. It's a temporary sacrifice because you see, now you can capture the rook with two ways. You can take with the pawn and you can take with the knight. If you take with the pawn, the knight hanging. And if you take with the knight, I can just take with the bishop, and it turns out white is having two minor pieces for the rook. And not any two minor pieces, but the bishop pair, which turns out it's completely winning for white. That's why we had the move knight cross b6 by Grischuk, and after playing a cross b6, it looks like it's an opposite color bishop. Now maybe there is some chance. And now we have rook a b8, because the pawn on b7 is hanging, so rook b8 looks very natural, very human. But it turns out the best continuation for Grischuk would have been to went for attacking both of the b and the d pawn at the same time by playing the move rook e to c8. The whole idea here is if you try to capture the pawn on b7, I can take the pawn on c2. And the whole idea here is if you try to play a move like b4 trying to protect the knight, I can play rook c6 attacking both these pawns. Though it's still pleasant for white after d7, but still it could have been a better try. Instead we have the move rook b8, and now, okay, I was going to ask you guys to pause the video and try to find the move, but I just showed you, which is a very nice tactic by Magnus, sacrificing the rook. It's a temporary sacrifice. And after g cross f6, now we have knight to d7. The rook is hanging, and if you try to move the rook, I can just take on f6. And after the king move takes, I'm just a pawn up, and that's completely winning for white. So instead, Grischuk decides to play the move f5. He's like, fine, my rook is anyways hanging, I'll just let you take the rook. Magnus is like, anyways, I can capture your rook anytime. I can capture the rook on b8, or I can play knight f6, giving you a check and capturing the rook on e8. So instead, I'm going to play the move c4, pushing the pawn. Now, you see, Magnus is showing how the b6 pawn is going to be a very strong pawn in the endgame now. He's pushing the pawn on c4, c5, and strong pawns on the queen side. And in this particular position, now Magnus' idea is to simply expand on the queen side. So Grischuk is like, let me first stop it with a5, stopping you from playing the move b4. Magnus is like, anyways, c5. And now finally we have bishop g7. So the idea behind bishop g7 is very nice. First, stopping knight f6. And second idea behind a5 here is, now Grischuk understands the position that Magnus is opening, like just trying to push his pawn. He needs to do something. So he has started already pushing his pawn on the queen side, and now not only it covers the f6 square, but it also attacks the pawn on b2, creating his own passed pawn on the queen side. Now Magnus decides to capture the rook, takes, and now it's a very interesting position. Try to pause the video and try to find a very nice plan found by Magnus, which is very interesting. Okay, so now a very natural looking move is you can play the move b3. Just moving putting the pawn on the light square, and that's a pretty fine position. You are still winning. But if you want to win, you see, imagine if there is no pawn on b7, how strong these 3 pawns already on the 6th and the 5th rank would be. So Magnus simply went for the b7 pawn with bishop a6. Boom. And that bishop a6 is simply an amazing move. First of all, if you try to capture the bishop, I can play d7. I want to make a queen. You have to stop it, and I can start pushing my c-pawn. And that's completely winning. You can try to capture the pawn on b6, but just c7. I can make another queen, and that's completely winning for white. So you can't capture the bishop. Instead, Grischuk decides to play bishop f6, covering this particular square on d8. But anyways, Magnus is like, bishop cross b7. I don't care. I'm going to give up my bishop for the b7 pawn. Rook takes, and now comes the move c6. Attacking the rook. Rook takes the pawn, and now a very nice move by Magnus. Like in this particular position after rook b6, you can't really push your c-pawn because after rook c6, everything is well defended. Like you can try this, but this is completely winning as black is having too many pawns. The descent is also not going to work because after rook cross c6, it's still the same thing. I can sack the bishop for the 2 pawns, which is winning for black. So instead, after rook b6, Magnus decides to play a very nice move, which is rook c1, putting the rook behind the pawn on the c file. And now his idea is pretty clean. He wants to push his c pawn. So, for example, if you try to play a move like rook b8, there is c7. Rook moves anywhere, I can just push my d pawn, and that's completely winning. So instead, Grischuk decides to play the move bishop cross b2, capturing the pawn. And now his idea here is his final trick. If the rook move, he can go back with the bishop, attacking the pawn on d6, and also threatening a back rank mate on the last rank. But Magnus is pretty sharp. He plays the best move once again, which is d7. And d7 is pretty clean. Like you can also play, I guess, if I'm not wrong, maybe c7 also wins equally. But d7 is even better because the whole idea is after takes, I can make the queen, giving a check and capturing the rook. If I would have made the queen on the C rank, I could have captured the bishop. But I'm winning the rook in this position. So that's the reason after d7, Alexander Grischuk decides to resign the game. And Magnus Carlsen won a pretty smoothing and pretty brilliant game. He played a very brilliant game. And after the game, even Garry Kasparov, the former world champion, commented that Magnus Carlsen simply played a brilliant game. So you can understand how nicely Magnus Carlsen played the game from the start till the middle game and the end game. Every move played had a purpose, had a plan, had a nice idea. Even having an isolated pawn, he knew how to play such kind of position by converting that isolated pawn weakness into strength of his own by creating a passed pawn and eventually winning the game. So I hope you guys enjoyed the analysis. This game must have, if you're a Sicilian player, it's even better. If you're a 1e4 player, if you're ever facing Sicilian, or even if you are a Sicilian player, this game is a pretty decent game to help you understand how to play such position. It definitely improves your middle game. I hope that you guys have enjoyed it. You improved it. If you did, make sure to like, share, and smash that subscribe button. I'm gonna see you soon in the upcoming video. Thank you for watching, and bye bye.